Thank you so much. A quorum is present. The second order of business is to approve the minutes of the August 5th, 2014 LBB meeting. Do we have a motion?
I move the minutes of the August 5th, 2014 LBB meeting be adopted.
Thank you, Speaker. Is there any objection from any member? Chair hears none, and the minutes are approved. The third agenda item today is the review of items of information and methodology required to set the Article 7 constitutional limit on certain appropriations for the 2016-2017 biennium. The chair recognizes Ursula Parks for an explanation. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Governor Dewhurst, Speaker Strauss, members of the LBB. My name is Ursula Parks, and I'm the Director of the Legislative Budget Board. As requested, I will be laying out the provisions of the Article 8, Section 22 constitutional spending limit. Article 8, Section 22 of the Constitution was approved by the voters in November of 1978, and it states that in no biennium shall the rate of growth of appropriations from state tax revenue not dedicated by this Constitution exceed the estimated rate of growth of the state's economy. The legislature shall provide by general law procedures to implement this subsection. General law does provide for that procedure, and the LBB staff have complied with it by identifying the items of information necessary to establish the Article 8 limit. The first item of information is the level of appropriations from state tax revenue not dedicated by the Constitution for the 2014-15 biennium. Our staff has calculated this amount to be $84.4 billion. As required by statute, the methodology and sources for this calculation have been published in the Texas Register. The second item of information is the estimated rate of growth of the state's economy from the 14-15 biennium to the 16-17 biennium. Statute defines the rate of economic growth to be growth in Texas personal income. Various growth rates were published in the Texas Register and also provided to you in a memo dated November 18th, 2014. You have a number of estimated growth rates before you. I will, in order, the first is from IHS Global Insight, and that rate is 11.93%. Moody's Analytics provides for a 15.71% growth rate. The Perryman Group, who's out of Waco, Texas, offers a 13.39% growth rate. And finally, the Comptroller of Public Accounts has a growth rate estimate of 11.68%. We've provided this information to all of your offices and to the Governor and the Comptroller. It is also posted on our website and available. That is the end of my explanation of the items pursuant to statute.
Are there questions for Ms. Parks?
Ms. Parks, a couple of questions, since this is my first time through doing this. If we were to try to use population and inflation, in your opinion, does the Consumer Price Index provide an accurate measure of what the government actually spends money on?
No, in my opinion, it does not. The CPI measures the change in a price of a specific basket of goods, of consumer goods and services over time. The kinds of things that state government spends money on are pretty different than that basket of goods. So the cost of building highways, of educating students, of providing health care, of these really major components of state spending could vary pretty dramatically from what that overall basket of goods would indicate.
Okay, so is it accurate to say that the inflation that affects the goods and services, depending on the type of government service that we're looking at?
Yes, it can vary considerably, yes, sir.
All right. Are there any times where population plus inflation has been greater than what we currently use under statute?
The actual rate of compounded population and inflation has sometimes been higher and sometimes been lower than personal income. It has not consistently, as an actual measure, been a lower measure. In the early 2000 and in 2002, I believe, the actual growth was in personal income was 6.7%. Population and inflation was 7.9%, so it was slightly higher. The same was true in 10-11.
And my last question is, if the board adopts this rate, or adopts the lowest rate that's given here, the comptroller's rate,
Yes, sir?
are we obligating the legislature to spend a certain amount of money?
No, sir. It operates as a limit. There's no obligation to spend up to that limit, and there certainly have been times when the legislature has not done so. And it could also, on option be exceeded, but it is in no way a requirement to spend up to the adopted limit.
Thank you.
Ms. Parks, let me follow up on Representative Otto's question, which I thought was a good one. And that is, and pardon me for looking in terms of just my own experience, I came into the legislature in January of 2013. So between either the 2002 fiscal year or when I came in January of 2003, is it correct to say that excluding property tax relief, where we cut taxes on people, excluding property tax relief, that our budget on average has been 11.5% below inflation and population growth?
That sounds correct to me, yes, sir.
11.5% members below inflation and population growth, Representative Otto. So that setting pursuant to state statute a spending cap limit, and particularly to pick up on your point, the lowest of the four estimates, which would be the estimate by the Comptroller of Public Accounts, would not bind us. If practice were in force, your next budget I would expect to be lower than that amount because we have kept our budget 11.5% below inflation and population growth. Let me clear up something. I've seen in my experience over the years special interest, oftentimes for fundraising appeal, say untrue things. Surprise, surprise. There was a workshop my staff told me about in the DFW area just recently, in which three of the presenters talked about our budget having increased 26% between the 2012-13 biennium and the 2014-2015 biennium. Is that a true statement?
No.
So it's not a true statement that our budget increased 26%. Is it a true statement that our budget increased some 8-ish%?
The growth in the all-fund state budget between the 2012-13 and the 14-15 biennium in appropriated funds was 5.1%.
5.1%.
Yes, sir. That is in all funds. In general revenue, it was 10.4%.
All right. Both numbers below the spending limit which had been set by the legislature, by the LBB.
The spending limit for the 14-15 biennium was 10.71%.
Thank you, Ms. Parks. Additional questions from members?
Mr. Chairman, just one question. There's been a lot bandied around about, again, population plus inflation, but is it fair and accurate, more accurate to say, even at that, it should be multiplied? There should be a multiplication of the population by whatever inflationary factor you use as opposed to an addition of the two.
That is correct. It is more accurate to express that as compounded population and inflation, so that you're getting the net effect of the two factors. They're not additive; they are compounding.
Thank you.
This public hearing has been called to solicit testimony with regard to the methodology used in establishing the items of information necessary for setting the Article 8 constitutional limit on certain appropriations for the 2016-2017 biennium. Technical memorandum concerning these items and the methodology was filed for the public inspection of the Secretary of State on November 19, 2014, published in the Texas Register on November 28, 2014. Notice of the meeting was posted on November 20th, 2014. At this time, I'd like to inquire whether or not there are members of the public who would like to testify today. Are there any members of the public who would like to testify? The public hearing is now concluded. Are there, members, additional questions of the LBB staff? Ursula, if you would you lay out the motion for the board's consideration this morning?
Yes, sir. The estimated rate of growth of the Texas economy from the 2014-15 biennium to the 16-17 biennium is 11.68%. The level of appropriations for the 2014-15 biennium from state tax revenue not dedicated by the Constitution is $84,408,716,116, subject to adjustments resulting from revenue forecast provisions or subsequent appropriations certified by the Comptroller of Public Accounts. And therefore, the amount of appropriations that can be made for the 2016-17 biennium from state tax revenue not dedicated by the Constitution without special concurrent resolution is $94,267,654,158, subject to adjustments to the 14-15 biennial appropriations, referenced in number 2 above.
And just to make sure that I heard you correctly, the number of 26% increase between 2013 and 2014, of the 2012 and 2013 to 14 and 15 was a false statement.
It is in our opinion a false statement, and one that seeks to compare the actions of one legislature to the next as opposed to one fiscal biennium to the next.
Right. And the all funds increase was a little over 5%.
Yes, sir.
Do we have a motion?
I move the Legislative Budget Board establish the Article 8 constitutional limit on certain appropriations for the 2016-2017 biennium as laid out by Ms. Parks.
Thank you, Speaker. Is there a second to the motion? Senator Nelson? Thank you. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Dewhurst.
Aye.
Senator Altai.
Aye.
Senator Estes.
Aye.
Senator Hinojosa.
Aye.
Senator Nelson. Aye. Speaker Strauss.
Aye.
Representative Darby.
Aye.
Representative Otto.
Aye.
Representative Turner. Representative Zerwas.
Aye.
There being 5 ayes and no noes on the part of the Senate, 5 ayes and no noes on the part of the House, the motion is adopted.
Well, thank you, Madam Clerk. The fourth order of business today is to consider the governor's budget execution proposal relating to securing the Texas-Mexico border. The chair recognizes Ursula Parks for an explanation.
Yes, sir. Before you members, you have a budget execution proposal that has been signed by Governor Perry as well as by Governor Dewhurst and Speaker Strauss. The budget execution proposal is intended to support continuation of the border surge that was initiated earlier this year. As required by Government Code, Chapter 317, the order stipulates that an emergency exists as follows: that there is insufficient budget authority at the Texas Military Department, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to assist the Texas Department of Public Safety to secure the Texas-Mexico border. In order to address the stated emergency, the proposal offers 6 discrete actions providing additional appropriation authority to the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas Military Department, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. The total amount to be transferred is $86.1 million, and I will just summarize those items quickly as follows. From Governor's Trusteed Disaster Funds, $10 million would go to the Texas Military Department to assist DPS in border security. From debt service appropriated to the to TxDOT, $47.9 million would go to DPS, again for border security, including paying overtime. From bond debt service previously appropriated to TPFA, $7.5 million to the Texas Military Department to assist DPS in border security. From bond debt service appropriated to TPFA, $10 million to the Department of Public Safety for border security, including overtime and capital equipment. From Governor's Trustee, the Emerging Technology Fund, $7 million to the Department of Public Safety for border security, including overtime and capital equipment. And finally, from Governor Trustee of Disaster Funds, $3.7 million to the Parks and Wildlife Department to assist DPS in border security. As I stated, the total transfer would be $86.1 million, coming from 4 different discrete sources of revenue and going to 3 state agencies.
Parks, thank you. At this time, are there members of the public or members of the legislature? Well, first, let me go to the members on the LBB. Members, are there comments on this proposal at the present time? Senator Hinojosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some general comments in that I live on the border. In the past and in the present, I will continue to support DPS surges. However, there are certain issues and problems that do exist down in the border area. I know that we move DPS officers from other parts of the state to come down to South Texas. And many times there's a lack of coordination between DPS and many of our sheriff's offices and police officers. I'd like to see better coordination. Second, we have a shortage of law enforcement officers in the different sheriff's department, Hidalgo, Cameron, Starr County, Zapata, and I do not think that we should be spending any more money on the Texas National Guard. It militarizes the border, it sends a wrong message, and those monies could be better used by either creating a new Texas Ranger company, 50 Rangers stationed in the Valley, or creating a training center to train DPS officers so they could acquaint themselves with the border area, the people, the customs. We have a need for additional funds to allow our local sheriff departments to work overtime. In the past, Mr. Chairman and members, we had funds from the governor's office used to help pay for their overtime, not hire new deputies. But it was very effective because local monies could then be used to hire additional sheriff's deputies. And one of the problems, Governor and members, is that, quite frankly, the National Guard doesn't have any arrest powers. They cannot detain anybody. And to me, that money would be better used if we allocated and appropriated those monies to help the local law enforcement. And another issue that I will discuss with Steve McGraw, the director of DPS, is that we transfer DPS officers from other parts of the state, and I support their work, but they're not familiar with the area. And what happens many times when they make an arrest or open a criminal investigation, they do not complete the case, and they return back to Lubbock, San Antonio, Austin, wherever they're from, and then those criminal cases are never closed or concluded, and they're dismissed because they don't show up for court hearings, or they don't complete the paperwork. And right now we have a 90% rule under state statute that says that if you do not close a case, you do not receive funding from the different programs that we have here at the state level. So I do have a lot of issues. I don't have any objection to funding our border surges, but for us to continue doing this type of surge without reviewing the whole process and having some metrics to measure success, we need to develop that. Right now, there's also a lot of coordination between DPS and a lot of the local sheriff department. I think it would be much more effective use of the money that we're spending on the Texas National Guard to have a ranger company there of 50 rangers, which is a company which can investigate and which get familiarize themselves with the area and be much more effective in interdicting drugs coming into this country, interdicting human trafficking coming into this country, but also just as important, interdicting the amount of ammunition and guns going south. Mr. Chairman and members, I will support the funding for extra surge across the board. I will support DPS. Parks and Wildlife, we only have about 503 Parks and Wildlife officers in the state of Texas. They're under, they're quite frankly, undermanned. As we move more Parks and Wildlife people to South Texas, we're leaving other parts of the state open. I get complaints from ranchers and farmers. They don't have enough parks and wildlife people in other parts of the state. And for me, quite frankly, I saw what Governor-elect Abbott has suggested that we'll hire an additional 300, 400 DPS officers. The problem with that is that our salaries at the state level for DPS cannot compete with the salaries of law enforcement people, police in Austin, Houston, San Antonio. So we need to look at what we're doing and really look at the surges. If we plan to make them permanent, then do it right, but not use the Texas National Guard, which I understand is winding down and coming back home, for the simple reason that that's not making very effective use of our money. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Joe,
Ursula, can you give me a little more detail on the money you're pulling out of debt service accounts? I'd like a little more color on that, please.
Sure. So the total amount coming from TPFA would be $17.5 million. They had identified about $30 million in anticipated unexpended balances for the current biennium that would otherwise either lapse or be captured in the supplemental bill. So this would be a portion of that. The total amount appropriated to TPFA for debt service this biennium was a little over $500 million. It's not unusual for them to have some lapsing at the end of the biennium. Interest rates have been lower and they've refinanced certain packages. As for TxDOT, the total amount of debt service coming from TxDOT would be $47.9 million. They were appropriated just under $370 million for the current biennium, and I believe we're anticipating a total unexpended balance of about $70 million. So again, this is just a portion of the unexpended balance that they are anticipating. I believe that most of their funds are available just due to the timing of the issuance of bonds, maybe being a little bit slower than expected, and so they've got some savings on those bonds this biennium.
Okay. My concern, as always, is that over the last 10 years, we've more than doubled the state debt. So now we're going to pull some money out of some debt reserve accounts that was going to go toward debt payments. Is that correct?
These were appropriations to those two agencies to make debt service payments for the current biennium, and those payments just aren't as high as expected.
I mean, at some point, it'd be nice if we started paying some debt down, maybe additional principal every now and then. Have we ever thought about that? We're washing cash. Why don't we just write a check for this if it's so important? Why do we have to pull it out of all these accounts?
Budget execution requires that the funds to go for a specified purpose be already appropriated. You can't take money from the Treasury for budget execution.
So it has to come out of another account?
Yes, sir. It has to come from appropriated funds.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Representative Turner.
Yeah, and I simply want to follow up with that, and I want to tie it to the conversation that we had earlier on the spending limits. How much of the 86.1 would go towards the spending limits that we established last time? Is this a part of it?
Oh, these are funds that were already appropriated, so they were already part of the appropriated base.
Right, but the reason why I raised the question, some would criticize us for spending too much. Some said we spent too much in the last biennium. And now, instead of reducing what we appropriated, we're now taking what we appropriated, even though we didn't necessarily, we have the unfunded balances, and now we're getting ready to redirect those dollars someplace else. So I just think we just need to be mindful that we get criticized on one hand for spending too much, and then when we are able to either pay down on the debt or not to spend the money, we're directing it to something else. That's number one. Secondly, I think what would be important to me is the ramifications of what we're doing in terms of the surge, and I'm 100% supportive of DPS. I have not a problem with that. But I guess my question would be, what is the long-term ramifications of what we are doing? Because on an overtime program, we're using the same personnel. We're having them work longer. And what I'm hearing from some, even from DPS troopers, is that they are exhausted. And I guess my question, and maybe you're not the best person to ask this question to, what does that mean for the security and the safety for the rest of the state of Texas? Because even with individuals that come into the state from outside, they're not just staying, for example, at the border. They're showing up in Houston, they're showing up in San Antonio, they're showing up in other places. And if DPS, for example, is already understaffed, and we are taking an understaffed force and providing overtime, have we enhanced the safety and security of the state, or have we made the state more vulnerable through this particular program? That would be my major concern. Because what I'm hearing, for example, Governor, Mr. Speaker, is that there are more fatalities on our highways now, more now than there has been in a long, long time. And the question would be whether or not we have sufficient DPS troopers on our roads in other parts of the state in order to maintain the safety of the state. And then lastly, my question would be, when we started this surge program months ago, we classified it as an emergency. Do we still characterize where we are today as an emergency? Or is this simply something that we just think we just need to do? But is this still characterized, Ursula, as an emergency?
Budget execution requires that an emergency be identified, and so the budget execution proposal forwarded by the governor, it did stipulate that an emergency exists. A determination of that is of course up to each of you and your expertise and as you regard the situation, but it is absolutely a component of the proposal that is before you.
I know when we started it in June, it was characterized as an emergency. Now we're in December. And the question becomes, number one, whether or not it is an emergency. And even if people have legitimate reasons wanting to do it, and I assume that people do, the question is whether or not the emergency has subsided, that it cannot wait for determination to be made during this upcoming legislative session so that we can air this out and come up with a realistic, holistic approach to dealing with the issues that are confronting the state of Texas. Especially if we're going to engage in budget execution. I just don't know if an emergency that existed, that was in effect in June of this year, is still viewed as an emergency today, and whether or not it would be fiscally proven to have this matter thoroughly examined during this upcoming budgetary process, and then the legislature come forth with a much more holistic approach to deal with the border. And if it's concluded that we need to spend a lot more on the border, I vote aye. But I think there's a way to do it, and I think there's a time to do it, and I question whether or not this is the best way to do it.
Representative Turner, I have great respect for you. My personal opinion, as someone who has pushed for the implementation of the surge and pushed over the last year, is that the emergency continues. When according to prison officials, over 200,000 former and current incarcerees in our state prison system have committed 640,000 crimes, including over 3,000 murders. And we're still having people cross this border. I think, in my opinion, the emergency is continuing. My concern has been from day one that if we don't continue the surge through the end of this fiscal year, through August 31st, so that the legislature can act and, using your words, a holistic approach and look at whether more spending needs to be done, that our surge will lapse. And the next day, it's business as usual for the cartels. Absent passing legislation during the session with 2/3 vote in each chamber, which might be problematic. And that's why I, for one, am a vote aye on this matter. I have reservations about with the questions being asked, and all 10 of us will want to hear from Colonel McCraw and talk about some of these issues. I'd like to invite Colonel McCraw to the witness table to respond to some of the questions that have been raised about the effectiveness of our plan, and whether or not we have the ability to hire additional DPS officers. I know that with the assistance of the Speaker and the House, with the Senate, we have passed